Guitar tips, guitar tips, just the tips, just for you. Guitar tips. Hello and welcome to Guitar Tips Pro. My name is Adam Levy. This is my weekly, and this week I want to talk about diminished dominant sounds. Before we get into it, I want to ask you to think about two kinds of people who are funny, whether it's your buddy or a professional comedian that you like. One way to be funny is to just memorize a bunch of well-crafted jokes that you've just always got in your back pocket, and whatever the occasion is, you've got jokes, you know how to tell them, you've told them before. That can be very funny, if it's done well. And then there's another type of funny, which is just somebody who doesn't really know any jokes per se, but is very much in the moment and observant, and just by watching what's going on in any kind of situation, can say something that's very, very funny, something they've never said before, something you've never heard before, and it just really cracks you up. So for myself as an improviser, as a musical improviser, I try to be in the latter category as much as I can. I'm not a very canned jokes kind of person, and I'm not a very canned, I know some jokes. I'll tell you some jokes in another episode sometime maybe, but I have more fun outside of music, just trying to observe situations and react and be funny if the moment seems to call for it. And I try to be the same way on the guitar. I don't have a lot of just like licks up my sleeve. I try to be reactive and proactive and in the moment. So I want to mention that in regard to diminished sounds, because diminished dominant sounds. So before I go any further, let's just explain what that is. So here is a dominant chord. This is A7, and if you put a flat 9 on it, that's B flat on top, that's the flat 9. It has an interesting character to it, which is that it's kind of G diminished, and it's also A7 at the same time. And there is a scale that people commonly associate with that kind of sound, which is built alternately on half steps and whole steps. So you can start on A, and you go A, B flat, C, C sharp. So that's half step, whole step, half step. Then from C sharp, whole step up to D sharp, half step up to E, whole step to F sharp, half step to G, and whole step to A. So the whole thing. So that's a common scale as used over A7 flat 9. And but this scale, it's interesting. It's unusual. It's got this kind of symmetrical structure of half, whole, half, whole, half, whole, half, whole, and you can keep going. There's another half, another whole, another half. Very different from the major scale, which is asymmetrical, which would go whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. In that asymmetrical major scale, it's a lot easier to kind of hear the kind of gravity of it, places that you'd want to rest, and places that you'd want to resolve. But in this scale, because it's just kind of spiraling around, it's harder, I think, for a lot of people, especially when they first learn about it and learn some fingerings. This is hard to hear what's the beginning, what's the middle, and what's the end. it is a sound that if you're interested in any kind of jazz or jazz adjacent music, you're going to want to get a grip on this sound, but it's difficult. So I wanted to propose two different strategies for getting into this kind of scale and this sound, but really hearing it and not just memorizing fingering patterns. I'm not going to send you any fingering patterns for this. I really want you to hear it. Of course, I want you to really hear everything that you play, but this one seems to be a particularly challenging sound for a lot of people. I hope that by now, you can make real pure music with a major scale and perhaps some of the modes of the major scale. And I trust that you can do stuff with pentatonic scales, but this one's tricky. So here's two tactics that I use in my own exploration and also in teaching practice. And I hope that you will find them hearable and accessible so that you can actually put them into your playing and not just have a bunch of canned jokes in your back pocket, if you know what I mean. So here's strategy number one. If you look at this scale as an 8-note scale, which it is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then back to the octave. The note that seems like the important note would be the flat 9, because this scale is often suggested as a scale choice to improvise over an A7 flat 9. If you have a song or you see a chord chart with A7 flat 9, teachers may recommend that you try this scale. But actually the flat 9 is, I think, the hardest note in there for people to hear if they're not used to it. I mean, as far as your own improvisation, hearing it inside your own head. So what if we just don't play that flat 9 for a moment? What's left? Okay, so now we've got this. I'll come down the scale. Okay, I can hear that. That's kind of a bluesy note. That's the flat 7 of A. And down here I can hear it also an octave lower. Okay, keep going down. That's a 6. And that's kind of, I think you could hear that if you've got some experience playing blues. Any kind of sophisticated blues would have both of those notes in it. It would have the flat 7 and the 6. That's more of kind of a B.B. King sound, using the 6. And then that's a more common kind of blue note, Chicago blue note. And then, well, that's just the 5th. I'm sure you can hear that. That's not so hard to hear. And then that sharp 4, if we hear it as a blue note, well, that shouldn't be too hard to hear if you've played some blues. And then the next note down is the major 3rd. Well, hope you can hear what that sounds like. And then below that is the sharp 9, which I kind of hear it in blues anyway as a kind of a lower companion of the 3rd, or it could be something that springs off the root. And I'll usually give it just a slight little bend, as you may have noticed. So that's what's left. So it's kind of bluesy. There's So when you see in a chord chart A7 flat 9, one strategy to avoid sounding just like that you practice a bunch of patterns, because you know what I mean. Like sometimes you hear people when they get to a chord like this, they'll just play a lick that they know. See, I don't have a lot of licks on tap. Stuff like that. sounds cool, but if you're not really hearing it, then it gets less cool pretty quickly because you don't know how to start, you don't know how to stop, you just kind of throw it in there. So a strategy for that is just avoid the flat. One strategy to avoid these kind of licks that go nowhere is avoid the flat 9 and just see what happens. So if you're going like A7 flat 9 going to D minor, you might go, I'll just do a bar of each. 2, 3, 4. Anyway, try that, experiment, see what happens. Okay, strategy 2. Strategy 2 is when you see this A7 flat 9, think of the diminished sound that's related to it, which is this arpeggio. So you can, if you're in A7 flat 9, you can think of the flat 7 and go up in minor thirds. That's a minor third interval, minor third interval, minor third, minor third. So that gives you this arpeggio, and that hopefully is something you can hear. I'll scramble it around and learn to hear those notes. So that's 4 notes out of the diminished dominant sound. The other 4 notes, you could think of them, if you have that in your ears and under your fingers, it's the 4 notes that are just a half step below each of those. So you have this, now you've got this. So those are just chromatic lower neighbors. Below the G, there's an F sharp. Below the B flat, there's an A. Below the C sharp, there's a C natural. Below the E, there's a D sharp. So that's, you could practice lines like that. 3, 4. I'm trying to hear this stuff and then hear these neighbors that are just next door. Another way to think of it is using the whole step upper neighbors of each of these tones. So again, here's the arpeggio, and then you've got these upper neighbors. So this note is an upper neighbor of this. This note is an upper neighbor of this. This note is an upper neighbor of this. So again, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. Right? So rather than giving you a bunch of licks, when I first started thinking about how I was going to explain diminished dominant sounds in a guitar tip, my first instinct was, I know, I'll write a bunch of licks and share them with you and you can practice them. But I didn't think that was going to get you any closer to what I think is the real goal, which is to be able to hear this stuff and play it from a deeper place and not just some memorized stuff. So spend time with it this week. Try both strategies. If you've got a looper, you can use a looper to lay down some chords for yourself. If you don't have a looper, maybe you can find some backing tracks online. There's a tune you might want to learn to play by Jim Hall, the late great guitarist Jim Hall. He wrote a blues tune, a 16-bar blues tune called Careful. Maybe I'll put a link to it in the text part of this tip, and you can check it out. That would be a cool tune to learn as far as learning some vocabulary around these sounds, because that the entire song Careful that Jim Hall wrote It's kind of using this scale over each of the various changes in a blues. I think it's actually in A. Yeah, it might be a 16 bar blues in A. So that'd be a good tune to check out. If you listen to John Scofield, you will have heard this sound. If you listen to any, fairly contemporary jazz, you've heard this sound. You know what I'm talking about. You just maybe don't have it under your fingers. So try playing the 8-note scale, but eliminate the flat 9. That was strategy 1, and that just leaves you with some blues, which you should be able to hear. You still get plenty of interesting notes in there. You've got the 6, which is the 13. You've got the sharp 4, which is the sharp 11. You've got the sharp 9. So plenty of color in there, even without the flat 9. And then the second strategy is start from arpeggios. You can have you can build it from the flat 7. Actually, you can also think of it as going up from the flat 9. Same idea, up from the 3rd or up from the 5th. Any one of those, if you go up in minor thirds from the flat 9, from the 3rd, from the 5th, or from the flat 7, you're going to wind up with the same diminished arpeggio, and you'll still have the half step lower chromatic neighbors or whole step upper chromatic neighbors. Try it out, record yourself, experiment, keep track of your results by recording it or just journaling about it or both. Maybe I'll talk some more about this next week. Until then, stay tuned and take good care.